Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this first session in a series about conversations on well-being. I'm going to introduce you to David Gumbrell. David was a former head teacher, and over the last 4 years, he's researched and published a number on a subject of resilience. He has also written NAHT Discovery Education Pathway courses and has published 3 books for teachers, Lift, Risk and Spin, on resilience and decision making and time and task management respectively. And earlier this year and last year he performed a number of sessions for us about zooming in and zooming out, and he is a very funny chap, very welcoming and very good. So no more ado, I'll pass you over to David.
Well, good morning, colleagues. What a pleasure it is to have this time with you, and I very much hope that it's going to be useful time for you all. So as Paul said, I was ex-head teacher and very much enjoyed that role, and I now work at Kingston University, and I'm very interested in occupational well-being in general. And what I want to try and do is give you a sense of how do we get occupational well-being, and what do we need to do as individuals in order to achieve that? Now, I think there's 2 things here. Where are we in all of this? And if we can make those 2 connections, then I think that will be quite valuable and interesting for us. But firstly, just well done for taking the time to stop and to think. I always found that quite tricky as a head teacher to find that time to stop and think. I always wanted to, but I wasn't sometimes able to give myself the warrant to take some time to think, yeah, where am I going? How am I doing? What is working? What is not working as well as I would like it to be working? And importantly, this question here of why do you do what you do? And if we can tap into the why, then I think we're in a much stronger place. I was working with a group of head teachers the other day, last week, in fact, and we were really trying to get to the why. And we had to go through the what and the how in order to get to the why. What do we do? How do we do it? But importantly, why do we do it? And as we discovered, I think, was why don't we do it? Because this is the important thing. Why don't we do some of the things that we should do? And it may be time, it may be capacity, it may be because of COVID. And of course, I don't know your COVID situations, so I can't possibly explain that or explore that too deeply. But nonetheless, we have to contextualize it, don't we? And we've got primary practitioners, and we've got secondary practitioners, and we've got special school practitioners. So again, you've got to work within your own context and contextualize it for yourselves. So I've put together what I think is a collection of useful questions for reflection. And if you want to, we can use the chat function to explore that together. If you would rather, because it's remote and it's difficult sometimes, to come off mute and have a conversation live, and that's absolutely fine. Or as other sessions have led to, just a sense of time to stop and to think, time to just allow yourselves to contemplate where your school is at, where your setting is at, and where you are within that setting. So I hope that's going to be useful. We're certainly going to be finishing on time. I pride myself on that, and I treasure your time. I think it's incredibly important that I do that. So rest assured, we will not be going over. I'm happy to take questions as we go along, because I think that can be really useful and effective when that can happen. So please do put the chat, use that chat feature. I've got it open on my screen, so I will see that as we go further forwards, for me to explore other areas, or for you to challenge things that I'm saying, or for you to want me to articulate in more detail a certain aspect of what we're talking about this morning. But essentially, kick back, relax, and enjoy the next hour of really thinking about you and your organization. So if we're going to pick off what, how, and why, the easiest one to do that is the what. What do you do? Or importantly, what should you be doing? Because sometimes we know we should be doing something, but we don't. But we need to challenge that. We need to challenge that narrative. Why are we allowing ourselves to not do it? What's getting in the way? What's the excuses that we're giving? What excuse are we giving to ourselves that allow us to not do that? But in some ways, the what is the easy one, isn't it? I don't know about you, but I always find the what is the easy one. What am I doing? Well, I know that I'm doing this. How are you doing it? Well, that's a little bit harder, isn't it? When we start to explore how do you do what you do, we have to drill a little bit further down, don't we? We have to come up with reasons, almost reasons why, as well as how, in order to establish that. But what do you do? Well, you're a head teacher, but what do you do on a day-to-day basis? What are the things that you feel you need to tick off your list? What are the things that are directions of travel that you take? And then how do you do that? How do you achieve all of these things? And then importantly for me, folks, is this one. Why do you do what you do? Why do you choose to do the things that you do? And why do you choose to not do other things? And importantly for me, and hopefully for you, if we get to that sense of why do you do certain things and not other things, getting us to think about, well, why don't we do other things? Why do we do the things that we do? And are we focusing on the right things? Now, as a head teacher, I was passionate about emotional leadership. And I think we're all very compassionate, aren't we, as a profession in general? We want there to be organizational well-being. We want our staff to be happy. But how do we achieve that? And if our time is limited and our own capacity is limited, what can we do to focus our energy and focus our time and focus our attention in the right places? And so what I want to do is to take Daniel Goleman's work of emotional leadership and some of the competencies that he identified to get us, or to offer us, a framework around which we can consider this what, how, and why. And as we go through the 4 competencies, the 4 areas of competencies, and not all of them because we haven't got time, you can start to think, okay, well, I've got that one nailed and I've got that one pretty good, but I'm not quite so sure on this one. I don't really have breadth across all 4. I'm strong in this area, but I'm not as strong in this area. Or, oh, I think about this quite a lot, but I'm not sure I think about that one as much as the others. And not in a negative way, chastising yourself that may be a fault or a weakness of you, but more a case of, okay, you acknowledge that that is the case, and what are you going to do about it? Why does it matter now to you? That is important. Okay. So I'm a big fan of Daniel Goleman because he was able to offer us some qualitative data. And as I'm sure you're aware, education is dominated, is it not, with quantitative data. And we tend to define things with numbers and percentages and decimals. But underneath all of that, I hope you would agree that there are the human beings that maybe can't be measured and quantified in that same way. But what Daniel Goleman did for me, and hopefully for you, was to define the art of leadership in ways where I felt it was really quite tangible. He was able to articulate for me things that I knew were important, but I wasn't quite able to tangibly grasp. So what I'm offering you today, folks, is something tangible, something that we can consider, something you could measure yourself against. And that can be quite important. So of the four, one of them is self-awareness. Now, I think this is quite interesting juxtaposition between occupational well-being of others and well-being of ourselves. And that we are central to the well-being of our collective organizations. So that what we are doing is having a knock-on effect, a domino effect, a ripple effect onto other people. Now, that seems fairly obvious when I say it out loud, but have we stopped to think about that? Within self-awareness, we've got emotional self-awareness, accurate self-assessment, and self-confidence. Emotional self-awareness, being attuned to our inner signals. Now, this is where I want to dive into the kind of metaphor or the idea of the ostrich. I was guilty of ignoring my inner signals. I knew what they were, but I just pretended they weren't there because I had to keep going, didn't I? I had to be there for everybody. I had to be present for duty. I knew my limitations and strengths, but I wasn't keen on telling everybody that I did have limitations. And I'd followed a head teacher that was really good at, superhero superhero strength, not this kind of vulnerability and accessibility. And I'm not perfect. I have limitations as well as my strengths, and I'm open and honest about them. And then self-confidence. Do you have presence? Or when you don't have presence, what is it that stops you from being able to have that presence? It may be that you're tired. It may be because you haven't looked after yourself. It may be because you've been knocked off by a parent and your energies have been distracted. So you're not kind of there and present. But if you're not, what effect is that going to have on others? So let's stop to think. Our body is our barometer. Sometimes we don't have time to stop and to think about what that is telling us. But if you just stop now and think, okay, how am I feeling? It may be anxiety, it may be worry, it may be calm, it may be supported, it may be a whole raft of different things. But you know yourself best, and you know what your inner signals are. For me, I know it's achy shoulders. I know that my achy shoulders is a sign that I'm not quite right. I'm under stress, I'm under pressure. And that for me is my barometer. So that's what my inner signal is, or that's one of them, because it's not about me. I'm just giving you an example. How do you know you're not quite right? And then importantly for me, that final one with the ostrich idea and the ostrich concept, why do we ignore that inner signal? Is anyone brave enough to come onto the chat and explain why they ignore that inner signal? I won't use your name if that's reassuring for you, but if you want to interact with me, that's a good one to do. Because I think this is of the three, that's the most important one. The what's quite easy, the how's harder, the why is the killer thing. Because if we can overcome this why don't I, then we can deal with it. We can manage it in ourselves. Thank you. So an interesting starting point there. It's time pressures, okay? And I think that is probably one echoed by many. Time pressures. We don't have time to do this stuff, David. It's all well and good you saying this stuff, but we don't have time. I would argue, folks, that if we are going to focus on anything focusing on our own energy is the best place to focus on. Because if we're right and ready, and if we look after ourselves, then we're in a better place to look after others. Therefore, it's time well spent. Okay, let's look at some others. Not wanting to let other people down. My challenge to that would be to think about, are you not letting other people down if you're not looking after yourself? Because then you don't have that presence. You don't know your inner signals. How can you possibly expect them to know their inner signals? If you're under pressure, you may react to the situation in a misaligned way. And that's not their fault, but they get two barrels because you're under pressure and you haven't alleviated that pressure in your own way. Yeah, putting the needs of others first. That's a classic, wasn't it? I did that. I put others first and then me if I had time. But if we say, if I've got time, I'm going to look after me, we never get to it. But if you turn that round and say, if I look after myself, I'm ready and able to look after others, then that can change it, because they have their own needs and you can support them in that. But you can only support them if you've actually nurtured yourself. And yeah, feeling guilty about not doing things or asking someone else. It's this not doing it. It's the busy badge, isn't it? I call it the busy badge. We all need the busy badge all of the time. And it's a measure of busyness and a comparison of busyness. But I would challenge that busyness is effective working. And actually, we need to stop in order to go faster. We need to slow down every now and again to have time to reflect and to think of others and ourselves. Where are we at? And hopefully this is starting to have that thought and have those conversations. We tend to think that others are more important than ourselves, but if you go down, then others are going to go down. It's not about passing on your feelings. Okay, it's not about passing on your feelings. You're more likely to pass on your feelings if you're not looking after yourself. And it's more likely that those feelings will be negatively distributed amongst other people. But we have to find an outlet for ourselves, or we need to look after ourselves. Brilliant. Some fantastic ideas in there, folks. Fantastic ideas. And great that you're interacting with me. And hopefully that's cathartic and useful for those who are putting them up. I'm going to come on to some more if I get time, but I'm just conscious of moving on just a little bit, but we'll come back to it. You're all aware of SWOT. I'm not going to pretend that you're not. There's no reason for me to do that. But I think it's interesting, isn't it? We tend to identify things as strengths and weaknesses. There's no area of grey between those two things. But of course, we do have some strengths and we do have some areas to work on. And because we're vulnerable, imperfect human beings, aren't we? Well, I am. I don't know about you. But I think most people are. And then the terminology of an opportunity or a threat is a filter of our own, isn't it? How do we perceive it to be? Someone can stand in front of a roller coaster and see it as a threat. Someone can see it as excitement and opportunity for excitement. So what are your strengths? And are you confident in saying that? Importantly, what are your weaknesses? Or what are your areas of development? Because we're not allowed to use the word weaknesses, are we? But essentially, that's what they are. Vulnerabilities, areas of development. But you're not good at everything. But hopefully you've got someone or something else in your team that can help and support it. And I always saw myself as a team with my deputy. She was good at paperwork. I was better at people. The combination was great, but we acknowledged each other's strengths and weaknesses. Not only why do we see things as threats, but potentially it's when do we see things as threats rather than challenges. And I think what you'll come to, the conclusion that you may come to, folks, is we see things as threats when we're feeling vulnerable. We see things as threats when our own well-being is being challenged. But we are less likely to see things as threats if we're looking after ourselves. We can see things clearly. Actually, it's not a threat in the real scheme of things, but it rightly perceived as feeling a threat because of our filter, our own personal filter of how we interpret this situation. So again, what I want you to consider is, do you have time to look after yourself? And when you do look after yourself, do you see things differently? Do you see things clearly? Do you interpret things more as opportunities and threats? And that this can be a positive thing. And then we talked about presence. Have a read of that, Amy's words there. So she feels that we confer it on ourselves, but we've got to top ourselves up, haven't we? We've got to top ourselves up to do that. I think we all have different interpretations of what presence looks like. Do we always have to be the bouncy bunny with a big smile on our faces? Or actually, is it our responsibility to show and demonstrate that we can't have presence all of the time, but others could, and that we can split that up a little bit? How do you radiate your presence? And potentially, how do you radiate your presence when you're not feeling love or comfort or comfortable within yourself? You've had a difficult parent meeting. Are you still expecting yourself to still have presence out in the school where you feel battered and bruised as a result of a interaction with a member of staff, a governor, or a parent? And probably the answer is yes, but maybe in thinking about it and considering it, the answer could be, well, maybe I need to look after myself first, and maybe I shouldn't expect myself to have presence immediately after being battered and bruised, metaphorically, by a previous incident. And on a previous NAHT webinar, we talked about the idea of a 50-minute hour, and the idea that there is time within each hour, possibly not 10 whole minutes, but maybe 5 minutes, where we just check in. We just check in on ourselves and see how we're going, so that when we are out and about, we do have that presence. Why do you think that presence is important? Why do you think it's important to radiate presence as much as you can? And maybe the answer comes back quite clearly, is that people are looking to you to have that confidence in order to give them confidence. And if you're not offering them that, then they're going to have to find it elsewhere, or they're going to have doubts, they're going to have worries. And that's why it's important. And that's for, particularly, it's important that you look after yourself. So just have a think now. Where would you put your dots? You don't need to actually do it, but where would you put your dots, folks? Okay, you can't click on the screen. It's not an interactive in that regard, but where would you put your dots? Having spoken about it now, where would you put your dots? I would imagine that what you're thinking is, but it depends, David. Depends on what day it is. It depends on what time of the day it is. It depends what day of the week it is, David. Okay, I agree. I absolutely agree with that. But on trickier days, we need to put more into ourselves because we know it's going to be a tricky day. And it's at these occasions where we have to do more to look after ourselves in order to be able to rise to the challenge of the tricky day. And rather than chastising yourself with a low score in any of these categories, don't. But rather, what can you do today and tomorrow in order to boost your confidence, to boost the accuracy of your self-assessment? What do you need in order to get slightly better at it? This is the important challenge for us, is to learn from some of these areas. You may be always in all of them, but I don't believe that you are, because that's not doable, is it? But identifying what we need next in order to get ourselves higher is a much more developmental way of considering it. Okay. So what we're now going to consider, folks, is the second element. Notice again, please, that Daniel Goleman is talking about self-management. So occupational well-being, yes, but in order to achieve that, it's you. And yet you're telling me that you haven't got time, you feel guilty, you want to be helping other people. But yet Daniel Goleman is already starting with 50% of his leadership capacity is you. How do you find ways to manage your emotions? How do you do that, folks? Who do you share it with, outside or inside of school? How do you calm yourself down? How do you get yourself level? How do you bring yourself back to the moment? I know what I used to do. I'll just share it with you. And again, it's just me, but I always have. I had a governor's meeting and I'd had enough of a governor's meeting. I always used to go and find the kids, go into a classroom and find that kid who had the joie de vivre no matter what. It was raining and pouring. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon and they were still bouncing around like Tigger on Red Bull. I loved these kids because it topped me up. Transparency. How do we get an authentic openness? How do you achieve that? Do you look for that? Do you actually consciously think that what are the benefits of transparency in my organization and the well-being of all, including myself? And then, wow, I mean, if you haven't got adaptability, folks, in the current climate in which you're in, you've proved yourself way beyond what anybody would think was possible of any of you in the last 12 months and counting. Boy, are we adjusting to fluid change. But maybe rather than asking yourself the question of, are you able to adjust to fluid change? What are the downsides of having to react to that all of the time, be alert to these changes all of the time? What did you do to look after you in order for you to still be able to get up the following day and read the 60-page document about the changes in COVID regulations for the following day? Most of you have seen the film of Inside Out or heard of the film Inside Out. And it was really good at articulating, recognizing and dealing with and managing emotion. But yet we still, as adults, have a problem with some of these emotions that we find ourselves experiencing because we want to be there for others. We want to be right. We want to be compassionate. But yet we are human beings and we will feel all of these things and we need to recognize those in ourselves. How do you manage those feelings yourself? How do you share them with others? How do you mitigate against them? And then a challenging question, and again, maybe a chance for the chat box again, because we're trying to get beyond what and how and onto why. Why don't you always show your feelings? What is it that's stopping you from doing that? And again, you can trust me that I'm not going to say your name. I'm more interested in trying to get an understanding from you as to where you're going with this. But why don't we show our feelings? What's stopping us? Interesting, thank you. Fear of what reaction might be. The fear of reaction of what might be. And we're going to come on to that later, if that's okay. We are fearful, but is that not an indicative of a judgmental culture? Is that not indicative of an environment where to be human is not seen as acceptable? But yet here we've got two people talking about we don't want to look vulnerable. We want to be the all-powerful. We want to be the all-ever-present. My question to that would be, folks, if we're showing invulnerability, what message is that sending to others in your staff? That they too have to be invulnerable? That they too have to demonstrate that ability, that skill? But if invulnerability means that you're managing it and dealing with it in other areas and other places, they also need to know that they've got to find outlets to show vulnerability that's not in school and not in front of everybody. And then we've got this idea of others expect us to be in control and fully functioning all the time. But is that expectation created by ourselves? Because we present this beautiful, graceful swan, do other people therefore expect us to glide down the corridor in utter control? I don't know. It's for you to think about the ramifications of that decision to try and demonstrate invulnerability rather than accessibility and vulnerability, because vulnerability is indicative of the human nature. We are vulnerable, imperfect human beings. Here we go. So someone's saying we have to lead by example. I couldn't agree with you more. But are we leading by good example if we show him invulnerability? Because is that realistic? And surely we want realistic. And then there's a challenge about gender and girl weakness, and that challenge of gender around women in leadership. And I can understand that. I've never obviously felt that myself, but I think that could be a invulnerability that you're feeling. But if you challenge yourself as to what evidence that you have that is present and in reality that's what it is, or whether that's your perception of what it could be or might be, or whether that's actually something that's made you feel a lot more vulnerable, therefore you're going to show your tougher side. Thank you for those interactions. They're very honest interactions, and I think that everybody is benefiting from this level of vulnerability that people are putting up on the chat, because it allows us to realize that although we want to be the tough, bruising head teacher, we're not. None of us are really. And so this human element of ourselves is coming through now, which I think is really valuable and helpful for us to compare and contrast our own feelings and desires. not difficult to find the Dalai Lama on the money again in terms of how he sees transparency. I think that's spot on, isn't it? But if he's right, we certainly don't want to be promoting distrust and insecurity, do we? So we've got to be careful about this. And you've got to try and establish what, because we're going back to what, how, and why. What is the right balance? How can you achieve this level? And why is it important to share all of the details? Why is it important? Well, if the Dalai Lama is correct, if we don't, we're sending a very weird message to our fellow teachers, are we not? Inadvertently, maybe. Inadvertently, maybe. But nonetheless, there. Then if we look at adaptability, and boy, have you been adaptable over time. And the reason, I'm just going to go a slight aside here, but I think it's worthy of your time, is this is what you get when you go Lego skier into Google Images. But I went skiing once, and once was ample, and I was a secondary school pupil, so it was certainly a long time ago. And the one thing I do remember, other than being ridiculously cold and bruised and battered as a result of falling over far too many times due to my incompetence, was the idea that I needed to bend my knees. And that message of bend your knees, bend your knees, bend your knees, bend your knees was alive and well. And so I still take this into school, and I still take this into my teaching and in my training. Bend my knees, adapt to the moment, adapt to the situation. And that's why the Lego man is there, if you're wondering. But let's go back to the what, how, why. And allow yourself the opportunity to think about and to consider, what are the benefits of being adaptable or bending your knees? What can you see could be the benefits of those times and those moments? And I'm sure you could think of one if you consider it now. How is it helpful that you're adaptable? What were the benefits of that for how the situation was managed, the time that it took to manage that situation? These can all be really important aspects. Importantly, we've got to dive that little bit deeper. How can adaptability be achieved in reality? Because there's a theory, isn't there? There's a book we could buy. There's a okay now, because we're talking to us, David. But actually, when you come off this call, what's it going to look like in reality? How are you going to get started? How are you going to show it? And surely the why, think back to how you've adapted and changed to a world that you could never have possibly have imagined that you would be leading in right now. How have you done it? How have you done it? Take this moment now to consider just how many changes you've made and how adaptable you have been in the last 12 months. Give yourselves a pat on the back first and foremost. How did you do it? What lessons have you learned? What can you take forwards in terms of this essential element of adaptability? And again, if anybody wants to come onto the chat, I'm very happy to discuss that further. Those what questions are always easier, aren't they, than the how and the why. Hopefully you're getting the idea that digging down that bit harder is a good thing to do. Why are we feeling the way that we're feeling is a good place, rather than what are we feeling? Why are we feeling the way that we're feeling? That's an interesting concept. So one of your colleagues is talking about the idea of adaptability strengthens us. That's an interesting idea. It strengthens us. It allows us to ride the bumps, doesn't it? Or the mogul. Are they called moguls on the ski slope? They were able to get over the moguls, get over the bumps. And maybe that is strength. Maybe you're right. Interesting idea. Thank you for sharing that. And if you adapt to another person's idea, it shows that you respect. Oh, okay. So a development of respect. Oh, that's interesting. And that's a sense of growth. Sorry, this person is saying, if you can't see it, that if you take on another person's ideas and adapt to their idea, that demonstrates a level of respect. And I guess that means that they would feel better about themselves and feel that you were vulnerable and that you were adaptable and that potentially you would be held in higher esteem as a result of that. I love the idea. I love the idea of respect being developed as a result of that. Thank you. That's good. That's good. It's interesting, isn't it, how we start to really think these things through. On the surface, it seems so simple, but in reality, it's actually quite a challenge. And that's deliberate, folks. That's a deliberate purpose. I've deliberately pushed that through and got that to go. So here we are again, folks, at this scale, the Likert scale, I think it's called, isn't it? So if we look at that top one, do you always have self-control? Unlikely. It's very unlikely. But maybe through the conversations that we're having, you may think that that's a desirable outcome, or you're trying to achieve it, even if it's not desirable. But maybe it's not a good potentially place to be if we're listening to the Dalai Lama. How transparent do you think you are? And how transparent are you actually? And how would you know the difference? I felt as a head teacher that I was fairly transparent. And yet I found out in hindsight that there were times where they felt I wasn't transparent. Now, that's a clear indication of me being imperfect and vulnerable, of course, and I recognize that. But where are you on that scale? And importantly, how could you be one more on that scale? What do you need to do in reality, tangibly, on the ground, to start to develop this a little bit further? And I think you're quite adaptable. You must be, because of what you've been through in the last 12 months. You must be incredibly adaptable. So I think I want to change that question slightly for you. What's been the knock-on effect of you trying to be adaptable all day, 24/7 for the last 12 months? What's been the knock-on effect of that on you? Maybe that's a wiser question to consider. And again, if you want to share thoughts and ideas in the chat box, I'm very happy to see those and interact with those. But if you just want to think about it in your own way, of course, that is fine. So although it's occupational well-being, organizational well-being, it's still to you, isn't it? It's still coming back to you. Okay. So one of your colleagues there is talking about the never switching off. Now, to that person and to others thinking, well, what's the answer? It's very difficult to switch off. And I'm not going to say anything other than it's very difficult to switch off. However, what I would say is that unless you switch off, the only person that is affected by that is you in a very negative way. And it is debilitating for you personally and for others around you if you don't look after yourself, if you never switch off. Now, I genuinely believe that you can challenge the cadence of email. And that I do genuinely believe, because I've done it in schools and I've worked with staff, where you can challenge this notion of smorgasbord, open all hours, email whenever you want. More and more people that I'm interacting with, please don't be offended if I don't email you back immediately. I do respect your email. I will get back to it when I can. Rather than this sense of immediacy, the sense of I've got to get things done. I've got to demonstrate that I'm being reacted to those situations. And arguably, this person who's very kindly put that comment on the chat, if we are reactive in the moment now, that is an emotional reaction, and sometimes our emotions are not in the right place to make best decisions. I know that I was never in the good place when I made some of my decisions if I did them quickly, because other things are in charge in our minds at this point. Invest less of myself in things, as things may change, and this protects me and helps me move more adaptable. Thank you for that honesty. Thank you for that honesty. We maybe throw ourselves too much into some things that you know are not going to actually make a difference to young people in our care. So maybe we invest a little bit less in some of the aspects that we don't need to be thinking about or worrying about. Social awareness, we can speed up now because I think you've got the idea of where we're going with this. We need to be challenged around empathy, organizational awareness, and service. Attuning to our range of emotional signals, understanding the unspoken rules that operate among people at work, and make yourself available if and when needed. That seems like fairly sensible selection, I would have thought. But again, it's Daniel Goleman articulating what we want it to be. So what, how, and why in terms of listening to somebody? How do we demonstrate listening? How do we invest the time in listening? What does active listening when it actually comes to work? And importantly, that final one of why. Why is active listening important? Well, hopefully you'll come to the understanding that if people feel valued and you feel that they are being listened to, that massively helps them. It is hugely cathartic and it strengthens relationships. And that is why it's really important. But listening is exhausting. Listening is hard. Listening takes longer. But listening actually gets to the point quicker. And that's the key, isn't it? When we're challenged for time and we don't have enough of it, use of all time is important. And I love this slide, folks. This is my favorite slide. We always get, well, apart from the busy badge that we're all kind of running around with, I hear so often people saying, I'm fine. How are you? I'm fine. But actually underneath that I'm fine, this is what we've got. But we don't want to say anything other than I'm fine. And it's a modern phenomenon, folks. It's not something that we've always had. I'm fine. That's the automatic response that we give. But what are the ways that you can get through that I'm fine response for your own self and for others? How can you encourage other versions of I'm fine? Especially when we want authenticity and we want to know when people are feeling insecure or upset or angry, rather than it festering and developing into something much bigger. Always better, isn't it, to nip it in the bud? But ultimately, why is I'm fine not fine, folks? That's the hardest question on that sheet. Why is I'm fine not fine? Or why do we allow I'm fine, knowing that in reality that I'm fine isn't I'm fine? That actually underneath that there's other things going on. But I think if we can challenge, other than challenging the quantity of emails that we send in terms of saving everybody time, I think the other thing that you could tackle off the back of this conversation is tackling the I'm fine responses that you're getting. And you'll notice it when it's there. Open door policy, well, is that realistic? Who suffers from the open door policy? Well, you, because you never have enough time to focus in on one particular job and get that job done. So you've got to manage for your own what's a realistic level of availability. I always used to have times when my door was closed and times when my door were open, and people knew that it's going to be closed between 9 and 10 because I'm working, not because I don't want to see you, or not that I don't think what you say is important. More that I've also got work to do and I need focused time to achieve that. Okay. So what's a realistic level of availability for you? And how can you achieve that without feeling guilty, the feelings that we've had in the chat box, the feelings of guilt? And what's the impact of an open door policy for you? And then finally, Daniel Goleman talks about relationships, inspiration, influence, and developing others. How do we have a compelling vision? How do we get the right appeal? And how do we show genuine interest? Well, there's some questions there for you to focus on in your own time. The what, the how, and the why. There's questions there for you to consider about that listening and influencing and how these two things are directly connected to each other. And there's some what, how, and why questions there. What does development of others look like? Do we give them opportunity to develop what they want to develop, or are we telling them what they need to develop? Are we listening to what they want and offering them opportunities to develop that area? Or is your performance management so driven by what the school needs that the individual need is lost somewhere? But then if that's the case, ask yourself that final question of why develop others? So Daniel Goleman is telling us that we need self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationships management. But how can we have all of these things that Daniel Goleman tells us our leadership capabilities. And let's not shy away from how powerful that term can be. Leadership capabilities. These are the things that we need as a leader, but how are we going to achieve them? Well, I've alluded all along that what we need to do is look after ourselves, folks, and to not feel guilty about when we need to recharge ourselves, and not feel guilty that the time that may take to get ourselves back up to where we need to be in order to lead our schools. So therefore, the challenge is, in order to build ourselves up, what do you need? Chocolate? Going to the sea? Connection with other people? That's the easy bit. We've said all along that the what is the easy bit. The how is the harder. How do we get to do these things in order to top ourselves up? How do we make that time? Well, potentially we make that time because we know it makes a difference, because we know that if we're going to achieve Daniel Goleman's leadership competencies, we can't do that unless we look after ourselves. That you invest in you so that you can invest in others. It may be that gardening tops you up. It may be purely a cup of coffee that you need. It may be going to a sporting venue and being part of a big community, going to a church and being part of a big community. And that lifts you up and feels that you need that. You know what you need to do. I think the challenge for you is that how do you get that into term time? Potentially it's to argue the point that in order to top yourself up, you need to give yourself something. What do you need to give and how do you get it? Why does it matter? Well, if you don't give it to yourself, you're just the exhausted head teacher that's not effective, not reacting to situations well, finding yourselves just doing longer time because everything is taking longer because you're so tired and just so exhausted. So ask yourself, folks, what is it that tops yourself up? How are you going to get this into your weekly diet? And justify for yourself why it is important for you to do it. And then if you can get to this intangible, difficult why, whether it's cookery, whether it's photography, whether it's listening to Audible, you'll then give yourself the justification to look after you so that you can hit all of Daniel Goleman's competencies of leadership and to be the leader that you know you want to be. I promised that I was going to finish on time. As you noticed, I sped up a little bit in that second bit, but you can get the slides from the NAHT. But I hope that something that I've said this morning has given you something to consider and to think about, and that it was worthy of your time coming on the call today. And this is a series of webinars that I'm going to be leading, and hopefully it will encourage you to join in on more. But for the moment, good luck the rest of your day. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you, David. That was very, very interesting. And as David said, there are 3 more sessions that are due to come about between now and December, which you can book on. And I'm now going to launch a poll for you to fill in, if you wouldn't mind, to help us form our CPD. And just to let you know that next month we've got the SEND conference happening, and then in November we've got early years and primary conferences, which I would assume that if you attended would help your well-being and maybe help you manage some of your time for working in this industry of education. Has anyone got any questions, last minute questions for David before we finish the session today? Anyone want to unmute themselves and ask a question, or would they like to put something in the chat?
I'm very happy to answer questions, and as it says on the screen there, if anybody does want to contact me and develop these conversations further, I'm very happy to do that with you. As you can say, I'm passionate about this stuff. I really believe in this stuff, and I really want to help people to get to this point of happiness in themselves and occupational well-being as a result of that.
Thank you, David. Well, as David said, we will be emailing you these slides, and this session is being recorded, and this will be uploaded onto our YouTube channel, and you'll get the link to watch this again and maybe go over some of the points if you felt you didn't have enough time to consider what David has said today. But as that we don't seem to have any other questions in the box, I think we can call it a day, and I wish you well for the rest of your day. And if you've got any questions, you can always email us at events@naht.org.uk, and hopefully we'll see you next time when David runs the next session. Any last word, David?
No, great. Have a good week, folks, and I look forward to seeing you on the next session.
Thank you very much, and goodbye.